Party people! Tony Rowe back in action, continuing the practical chess ending series. It's been a while. It's been a while for any video. I do apologize for that. I also apologize up front that I'm a little bit sick. I think I have an upper respiratory infection, but I'm really bored, and I wanted to record a video, so here we are. And this video is going to talk about a very common ending, pretty well known, but very nuanced if you're not familiar with all of the options here. So we're going to talk about queen versus specifically one pawn on the 7th rank. And this can happen in many ways. From pawn endings, obviously, is one of the most common ways. Is you get to a pawn ending, one side promotes first, where the opponent's pawn is, let's say, on the 6th rank. So you promote, you make a queen, your opponent pushes the pawn to the 7th rank, and you have that one last move, that one last opportunity to interfere with your opponent's plans before he pushes his pawn to the 8th rank and promotes. And, of course, we're only going to talk about cases where your opponent's king is close enough to the pawn to support the promotion. Obviously, if you queen and your opponent is one move from queening, but you can just attack the pawn from behind or whatever, and it can't promote. That's not a particularly interesting ending. So we're going to skip past that one to the most basic case. And this will follow sort of the same format as the other practical chess endings videos that I've filmed, where I take a certain class of ending. We've talked about mating with the knight and the bishop, and we've talked about single rook endings where the pawn is on the 7th rank and your rook is passive. And in this case, we're talking about queen versus 7th rank pawn. So we're going to take this class of endings, and I'm going to start from the absolute most basic simple cases and progressively build up to what I consider to be basically perfect play, or all you really need to know about this ending. So, simplest case, first rule of this ending is that, very simply, if you can put your queen in front of the pawn, you automatically win. In this case, queen f1. Okay, very simple. That's the easiest case. I picked this position specifically because if you try to win with the usual method, it will not work. One thing we'll learn about this ending is that with the attacker's king, and by the attacker I mean the person with the queen, if the attacker's king is very far away, a rook pawn or a bishop pawn draws on the 7th rank, generally. And so in this position, if you would go about the usual winning method of trying to, which we'll see in a second, of trying to check and slowly weasel your way in with checks, you would fail because queen g6, for instance, king h2, queen f5, king g1 is a theoretical draw. There's no way for white to stop the promotion or capture the pawn without giving stalemate. We'll see that in a second. So if you're confused right now about why the hell this is a draw, give me a second. But in this case, putting the queen behind the pawn, insta-win. So that's good. Now, for any pawn, moving on, for any pawn that is not a bishop or a rook pawn, so not these pawns, but this pawn, this pawn, this pawn, and this pawn, these four, is a win. And the king can be anywhere on the board. The attacker's king can be anywhere. There's a very simple winning procedure, and it goes like so. Hopefully, most of you guys are familiar with this, so I'm going to go relatively quickly, but if you're not, no biggie. The winning method goes like this. You weasel your queen onto a square that checks the black king and attacks the pawn at the same time. So, for instance, queen d4 check, king c2. Black tends to not arbitrarily block the pawn because the threat of pushing is important to his defense. So, king c1 and king c2 would be the usual moves that you'll see in this position. So let's just say king c2, queen to e3, of course threatening to capture it. King d1 is the only move. Again, threatening to promote. So if white doesn't do anything, if white, let's say, wastes a move like an idiot with king g3 here, king g7, excuse me, then e1 equals queen draws instantly. So white pretty much must go queen d3, and this is the key to the ending. white will repeatedly set up this check that attacks the pawn at the same time as the check. And because king c1, the only other move besides king e1, loses the pawn immediately, black is forced to block the pawn. And this gives white one move to bring the king closer. And you just simply repeat this over and over again. So after king f2, you could also start with queen f5. That would win. It's just a little bit slower than queen d2. Queen d4 check is also a win. Queen d2, king f1, queen f4, same idea. King g2, again, black does not block the pawn. Queen to e3, attacking the pawn, forcing king to f1, and then queen f3 check. Attacking the king and the pawn at the same time. Black is forced to block the king. You bring up your king. You do the same thing over and over again, same procedure, over and over again, until the king and the queen attack the pawn simultaneously when it's blocked, and black can't stop the capture of the pawn, and mate follows very quickly. So that's the general winning procedure when you're not up against a bishop or a rook pawn. Okay, and if you're not familiar why a rook pawn or a bishop pawn's a draw, we're going to cover that also, just to be thorough. So if white attempts the same procedure here as they did in the last position, for instance, queen b5 check, king to a1, we can already see the issue that if white were to make some nonchalant move like queen b4, that's a stalemate because black at this exact moment has no legal move. But let's just say I continue to snake in with a move like queen a4, just getting closer to the pawn, king b1, queen b3. Again, I'm trying to attack the pawn and the king at the same time. Obviously, king c1 is horrific. That loses instantly for black. But king a1, again, forces this problem where white needs to move the queen away to a less optimal square because of this stalemate threat. For instance, queen a3, king b1. And again, I'm threatening this promotion. White would have to go back. I would go back. And so white simply can't make progress against a rook pawn because essentially black needs to play in this needs to be able to play in this position. White needs to be able to make the move king g7, and black needs to be able to move the king off the board to the left. But since there's an edge there and that's not legal, you run into stalemate tricks. As with all endings, there's always some scummy rook pawn exceptions. This one is no different. The one that is weird a little bit, I think, is the bishop pawn. And so again, the winning procedure fails. In this specific position, we can speed up the process. Of course, I could go queen b6 and then like slowly check my way in, but there's this check automatically. And the problem with the bishop pawn is that the square that the queen would capture the pawn on is a stalemate square. So if in this specific position, black could go king c1, and this also draws. But he has to know the same drawing motif, and he's really just wasting time. So we'll see in a second. I'll go back to that. But the problem with the bishop pawn is that king a1 exclam, and in general, in all of the other positions, let's say against a d pawn, moving your king away from the pawn like this would obviously be very sucky because you just lose the c pawn. But in this case, taking the c pawn is a stalemate. Again, a function of the fact that black's king is on the absolute corner of the board, and he has a bunch of missing squares that he should be able to go to, but he can't. And again, so king c1 would force essentially the same draw, just with a bunch of wasted moves, because after these checks, again, black just has to go back to the a1 square. But this is the problem. So black, essentially with a rook pawn or a bishop pawn, always heads into the corner. So if you're defending these positions and you have a bishop or a rook pawn, just know that don't let the queen in front of the pawn and always head to the corner, and you'll draw with ease. Okay, but now here's the complicated part, is that if the attacker's king is not that far away, and it can lend even the tiniest bit of support or improbable support to the queen, these endings are still sometimes winning. Either the king can snake in and guard the promotion square, or you can let the defender promote, and there are some tricky mates. So we'll see how that works in a second. I'm going to start with the rook pawn case because I think that is the simplest geometry to remember if you want to memorize the winning zones, that is. So we're going to start with the rook pawn. And the green circles here highlighted outlines the so-called winning zone. Your king needs to be on or within one of these squares on your turn. Okay, so if it was black's turn to move here, that's not a win. But if it's white's turn to move here, because his king is on one of the highlighted green squares, white is winning. And the main reason why is as follows. It's kind of cute. So we'll just start by properly arranging our queen on the correct square. You'll find in a lot of these endings that D2 is the right square for the queen when your king needs to go to this square. And I'm trying to avoid saying the B3 square because this geometry can be on all 4 different corners. But if it helps you, then think king on B3, the queen should probably be on D2. So we start with just a very simple set of checks to put the king on the D2 square. And after king B1, the real trick to this ending, well, take a second and see if you can figure out what that trick is. So if you've never seen this ending before, take, a minute and see if you can find the win here for white. Okay. The problem black has here is actually, it's interesting that he draws with a rook pawn and a bishop pawn because of all of these edge issues, right? When you're on the edge of the board, there's some weird geometrical issues that a lot of times cause weird things to happen in the endgame. And this mate is actually one of them. Because the queen promoting on the A1 square takes away a flight square from black's king, there's this really cute mating pattern. And it'll pop up again and again in this ending, so it's important that you understand it and that you see it. So white can allow black to promote with king B4, and on A1 equals queen, just very quietly go king B3. And there's no way to stop queen D1, queen C2, or queen B2 mate all at the same time. And curious enough, because of the horrible position of black's king and queen, he has no checks either. So you could imagine, all of these moves lose the queen. These 4, this one gets checkmated, this one loses the queen. Etc. Wait a second. Yeah, okay. I panicked for a second. Because I was like, wait, queen C3 check? Queen takes C3 is a stalemate, but king takes C3. Okay. It's allowing king A1. All right, I'm not insane. All of those moves lose the queen, and all of the moves that don't lose the queen move it way too far away and allow either queen D1 mate, queen C2 mate, or queen C2 mate actually isn't really necessary. Like a move like this allows queen D1. A move like this allows queen B2. So that's sort of the idea here. And I marked these 2 squares. This square is maybe more confusing than not, but it's probably closer to this. Live editing. So I marked these squares in yellow because those are the squares that your king is typically going to be on. And the logic for these squares will become apparent quite soon, but you can already sort of see how this winning zone gets sketched out. These green squares right here allow this king to make it to the B3 square in 2 moves. So just any of these squares you mate in the same way. You put the queen on D2, and then you walk the king to B3, and you can do that from any of these squares. Incidentally, that's why there's this weird cutout in the winning zone, is that this square is just geometrically too far away. You can't make it to B3 in time. And so that's why those squares are marked off. Now, if the king's on the other side, you have a couple of other options. and they all involve getting to this square in one move, and that's why you see these four squares highlighted specifically. So, for instance, again, we check. We put the queen on d2, and now excuse me, yes, and then king d3. So similar to the last case, the pawn promoting allows queen c2 mate immediately. So in this case, a1 equals queen allows queen to c2 automatically. In the last example we saw, it wasn't quite as simple, okay? But when the king is on this side, you can just mate immediately. Black's forced to promote to a knight, but excuse me, as I said, I am getting sick. In order to not allow queen to c2 mate, black has to promote to a knight, but after king to c3, there are no legal moves besides chucking your knight in the way, and you get mated in two. So the other possibility here, you can transpose to the other example by just going king to c3, a1 equals queen, and then king b3. But I just wanted to show that because that's not always available. For instance, if your king starts on this square, or like over here, you won't be able to make it to the c3 square in time, and you'll have to use the example of going putting the king on d3 and mating on the c2 square instead. Okay, and so you can see then how the winning zone gets sketched out. You're either one square away from these squares and supporting queen to c2 mate, or you're two squares away because you make that silent move at the end to put your king on b3. And again, remember that in that example, you want your queen to be on the d2 square. It can be on other squares. It generally is just easiest if it's along the second rank, and the d2 square happens to be the closest. So, okay. So that's the rook pawn, and however you want to remember this zone, I kind of think of it as a 5x5 square with the outermost corner taken off, and you can say it gets moved to that inner square, however you want to think of it. You can also just memorize b3, d3, d2, d1 if that's easier, and if you can get your king to that square, this one in two moves, this one in one move, however you want to think about it. I kind of find this geometry the easiest to remember, so I decided to start with this case. Now, the bishop pawn, the winning zone changes. This is why it gets a little bit more complicated again. The bishop pawn, the winning zone changes whether or not the king is on the short side. So let's say over here, this would be like what I'd consider the short side of the pawn, somewhere in this general area, or on the long side, on the opposite side where there are more squares. So for this side of the board, black having the pawn, this side would be the long side, and this side would be the short side. Oh, man. I killed my winning zone. Okay. But it's okay, because I have it memorized, I think. Yeah, okay. All right, and let's put those back in. Check it. Nailed it. Okay. All right. So we'll see why this winning zone is a little bit bigger in a second. The short answer is that if the king crosses over to this side, then you have all of the same options with the king on b3 as you did in the previous example. You could imagine the king on b3 here, the king on b1, and black going c1 equals queen, and then white just mates with queen to a2. Okay, so it's not queen to c2 this time, it's queen to a2, but the idea is the same. You put the king on b3 and black's allowed to promote, doesn't matter. Okay, the other option, because the king is on this side, when the pawn promotes to c2, or c1, excuse me, queen to e2 also mates. So you could imagine pawn here, let me use a different color, pawn here, king here, this queen coming to this square would be checkmate. So getting your king to any one of these squares also to support this queen e2 mate is winning. That's why these moves all allow the king to come to these squares in one move, and these squares allow the king to come to this in two moves. So it's similar to the other example. But I prepared two examples just to show you kind of how it works regardless, when the king is over here and when the king is over here. So again, similar, we can force the king to either give up the pawn. So in this case, queen to d4 check, king e2. Again, black is reluctant to block the pawn. Queen to c3, forcing the king to the d1 square. Queen to d3, forcing the king to the c1 square. And now white just brings the king in. That's king move number one. And because the queen is on d3, black has no choice but to step to pretty much the example we already saw, except with the pawn on a2. The idea is very similar. Again, we put the queen on d2. Black is forced to go king b1. And after queen b3, white wins. He's forced to promote to a knight, and then the king would move. You can see if he promotes to a queen, queen a2 is made. So that's the general idea. If he promotes to a knight instead, you just simply go like king a3, and black is forced to chuck the knight. So that is very similar to the examples we've already seen. When your king is on this side, you have to go to the b3 square, force the king over, and checkmate as usual. If your king is all the way over on g4, you're never going to make it to this b3 square, so you have to rely on this queen e2 mating idea when black promotes. And so again, you would check your way in, moving the queen ever closer, king e2, and again, queen c3, if you're wondering, since that was basically what we did in the last example, is also winning, very similarly. It just takes slightly longer, and I'll show you that line in a second. Queen b2 is just slightly more efficient. Black is pretty much forced to go king d2 or king d1. For instance, king d2 makes less sense because it pins the pawn. Queen d3 allows you to play queen c1 and put the queen in front of the pawn. So king d1 is the natural move. And same idea as before. Now that we have the queen along the second rank, we can go king f3. And this is one of the squares outlined before, if you forgot. And on c1, we go queen e2 mate. And as I said, queen c3 is probably more natural to... It's more natural to me, too. But the idea is the same. Queen d1, king d1, queen d3 check, king c1. The only tricky thing here that you have to remember if you play this way is that your king is way too far away to go to b3. And the only way you can mate black and win this ending, if the king is allowed to go to b1, is to put the king on b3. And so you cannot play king f3 here and allow king b1 because your king is way too far away. You must play either queen, I think queen b5 also wins, but queen b3 is far more natural. You have to play queen to b3 and stop black from going over to that side of the pawn. And on king d2, you'd be forced to play queen b2 anyway. And on king d1, you go queen f3 and you're back. So not recommended. It's probably worth at least remembering the idea behind queen to b2. It just so happens that it's worth noting just thematically that usually the attacker's queen is best placed on the 7th rank in these endings. You're always mating on the 2nd rank, and usually the queen performs other useful functions like pinning the pawn, for instance, attacking the pawn, etc. on the 2nd rank. So it's useful to just, if you see the opportunity to put it there in a sensible way, that's probably the correct move. So again, you weasel the queen in, force the black king to right next to where it would promote, thus restricting its escape options, and then you bring the king in for support. So that's the long side in a nutshell. Just sort of the same as the rook pawn, or you bring the king in from the long side to support this similar mating idea. Now the short side is winning zone is quite a bit smaller. Reason being is that with the black king already on that side, the king way over here is too far away. Black is threatening to go c1, and because the king will not be trapped on the d1 square and allow for these queen to e2 mates, you really only have options of getting the king to d1, which in most examples essentially just, along with the queen, stops the promotion, or the same mates as before that we saw on the long side zone, where you bring the king to b3 and you allow black to promote c1, and then you go queen to a2. So in this first example, that's what I'll show. You just simply go queen d2, you put your queen on the second rank, king b1, and queen b3. And on c1, queen a2. Of course, c1 equals knight. King a3 is something we already saw. This position is identical to the long zone, where black was forced from like e2 or d2 or wherever to c1, then to b1, etc. Now, there is one tricky thing that's interesting about this position, that king a2, queen to c3 is actually a massive blunder. Take a second, find out why. Okay, the answer, c1 equals queen anyway, because on queen takes c1, it's a stalemate. Bummer. So, but again, even the thought of this move can be prevented just by knowing that your queen should be on the second rank, and that this queen to d2 pinning the pawn to the king and forcing king b1, king b3 is just far better anyway. Okay, so that would be the sort of classical example where the king comes to b3. And if it helps you to remember, the king is usually, opposed to the opponent's king in these examples, because it's the only square that's generally close enough and also does not get checked when they promote. So another helpful rule. And if the king is on the opposite side, again, you're too far away to get to this b3 square. Your only option is to make have your king sit on this d2 square, and in conjunction with the queen, stop the promotion. So for instance, same position as before, I just move the king to the opposite corner. Queen b4 check, king to a1, king to c1, less good, but I'll show you in a second. King to a1, king to d2, king a2, king c2, king a1, queen b2. Okay, so I guess less good was pretty harsh. Whoops. So king to a1, king to d2, we see one of the points that black now, the king can't protect the pawn, and black guards a promotion square. If instead black guards the pawn and blocks the king instead, there is queen to c3, forcing king b1, but king b1 allows king to d2, and then now with the promotion square double protected, black loses the pawn. Okay, so that is 99.9% of what you need to play this endgame efficiently. There is one thing that I think is interesting. It popped up in a book. I forgot, when I was researching this, I totally forgot that this existed, but I think it's funny, so I'll show it to you guys. There is a small swindle when the king is on the short side. White can try a tricky little nuanced thing to try and win here when the game should be a draw. And it's something that maybe is just as helpful to know for the defender side as it is for the attacker side. So take the same situation, just with the king on b5. So we know from up here that the winning zone is, I don't know how you want to remember it in this case, over 3, down 1, over 2, down 3. That's pretty bad. But yeah, so it looks like this. Okay, so we know that the king is outside of the winning zone. Even with white to move, he's one move short. Because in this specific case, you need to be able to get to this square in one move, which you cannot do. Either of these squares in one move, which white cannot do. Now, white can try this little trick. And the to do with putting the queen onto this e2 square. And I'll show you why the e2 square in a second. So we go queen b4 check, king to a2, queen to c3. Now do note that in this case, c1 equals queen is not a stalemate because your king is outside the zone. Another funny little nuance. White can just take it, and you would have king to b3, and you'd be winning. So in this specific case, queen to c3 is fine. King to b1, queen to b3 check. I don't think you specifically need to play this move. I just chucked this in here to make a point that in this ending, when you're close, it helps to just give your opponent every single chance he has to make a mistake. And what I mean by that is that king to c1 here loses for black. It forces him to the long side, after which king to c4, king to d2, white's king is well within the long side winning zone now. So the long side winning zone, as you might recall, looks like this, and white is in that now because we've tricked black into going to the stupid side of the pawn, in which the winning zone is quite large. So you chuck in this check just to see if black will go king c1. Maybe he doesn't know about the stalemate trick, or maybe he thinks both is a draw. He doesn't care. But you chuck in this check just to make sure he goes king a1, and then you can go back. And so now you try the main trick. You go queen to d3. Okay? Now, king to a1 draws immediately. As far as I know, I don't think there's any way for white to even attempt some kind of trickery here. Okay? I mean, white sort of has to capture the pawn. I guess you can think about going queen e3 or queen d2, but black is just going to go back. And then if he knows to go king a1, he's probably going to go king a1 again. But queen d3 also allows black another option to unpin the pawn and not lose it with king to b2. And this is still a draw. Black has not totally bungled this yet, but it does allow white this opportunity to play this funny move, queen to e2. And queen to e2 is important. King a1 is still a draw. So king a1 would draw the game. That's the drawing line. But if black gets lazy and he plays king to b1, he transposes to a position we've pretty much already seen after king to b4. c1 equals queen, king to b3 with a win. And the point is that queen to e2, we saw this position already, but with the pawn on a2, okay? And on a1 equals queen, the optimal square in that ending was with the queen on d2. Doesn't really matter. The queen could be on e2 in that case. But in this ending specifically, because the pawn is queening on c1, the queen has to be on e2 or further, but the trick only works because the queen starts on d3. Your only option is queen e2. It has to be on this square because promoting the c-pawn would attack the queen on d2 and you wouldn't have time for king to b3. So, for instance, here, king to d2, king to b1, queen to b4, c1 equals queen illustrates the point. What black is threatening to capture, so you don't have time for king b3. You must go queen to e2 and pray to God for king to b1 when king to b4 works. Again, as I said, king to a1 is always a draw here, pretty much in every sort of position. So, again, a nice takeaway here for the defender is when you're on the short side and you're forced to move the king, it's pretty much always correct to never block the pawn and always go king a1. And if you're the attacker and your king is just one square out of the zone and able to get to b3, so you could imagine like this square, this square, this square, this square, this square, this square, any of those, you can try this trick with getting in close. You can check them first if you want to see if they block the pawn. If they don't block the pawn, you can reset and then play this queen to d3. This basically you pin the pawn and hope he steps to the side of it, and then you pin it again 2 squares away, and pray for king to b1 when king to b4 wins. Okay, so that concludes basically everything you need to know against for queen versus 7th rank pawn. Quick review. First step is if you can, put your queen in front of the pawn. That wins instantly. Second step is that if you, second option or sort of tier is if it's not a rook or a bishop pawn, you simply do this sort of check up the ladder. You get your queen close, you check and attack the pawn at the same time, you force the king in to block, and then you move your king closer. And you rinse and repeat over and over and over again, and then you simply take the pawn, okay? Now, If you're the defender, basically you always just put your king in the corner. With the rook pawn, you play king 1, and the queen is forced to move to avoid this stalemate position displayed here. And against the bishop pawn, it's basically the same. You always play king a1, and capturing the pawn leads to a stalemate. Now, rook pawn, the winning zone is almost a perfect 5x5 square, just with the corner taken out. And we talked about this getting your king to the b3 square, directly opposite, basically in opposition to the opponent king, if that's easier to remember for you. You can imagine that if the opponent's king is here, and it's white promoting this way, and you're black, you want your king to be on this square. If you can get your king to that square in 2 moves, you're winning. Similarly, you can support this queen to c2 mate idea, so allowing a1 equals queen and going queen to c2 mate by putting your king on any of these squares. And that explains sort of this almost 5x5 winning zone. Okay, you can think of it as over 4, down 1, over 1, down 4, however you want. Those mating ideas come up again and again. They're very thematic. Long side is similar, except you have extra options because when the king is on this side, promoting to c1 and having your king on d1 allows queen to e2 mate. So you get a bunch of these extra squares that are super far away that you wouldn't have otherwise, and getting your king to these squares in 1 move is also winning. And you have the same options of forcing the king over to this c1 square, and then this b1 square when your king is on this side, and putting your king on the b3 square, just as we saw earlier. Short side, the winning zone is very small because you don't have the mating option on e2. The king is already on the short side. Wrong side, the only options you have are getting to this b3 square in 1 move. You don't have the time for 2. Or getting your king to this d2 square and essentially blockading this c3 pawn. Blockading the c2 pawn before it gets to c1. Make sense? Shoot me some comments if you have any questions. I accept all compliments. I reluctantly accept all criticisms. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any sort of practical endgames that you'd like to see next, let me know in the comments.